This is the Java Web Users Group. Number 24. Look at this. Look at what Arwen has sent me. My goodness. And it's thanks to Wendy. Wendy over there. Wendy over there has kindly received all of this, and she has set this all out. So we thank her very much.
Wendy's fan here?
Yeah. Oh, I've been filmed. Okay.
So I had the idea of putting myself forward for doing the basics of basically using the basics of Java. And the reason for that is, well, I'll go into that in a moment, but I just want to take a little kind of straw poll. Who develops kind of basic websites just using the kind of core specification of JSP servlets without using one of the big frameworks like Struts or Hibernate or anything like that? I'm just wondering if anyone does that.
I have done once.
Yeah, and of course there's a reason for that, and the reason is that if you are a Java web developer, you kind of get sucked into one of the big frameworks, and the reason for that is the big frameworks initially, or a long time ago, were quite a long way ahead in terms of the core specification and delivering stuff which you just crank up pretty quickly. But that's changed, and that's what I want to go through tonight, just to show you what can happen if you stick with the core specification and just do something fairly simple. So, I'm Kevin Saunders. I am a web freelancer. I have a one-man company, and I do a lot of sites in Java. And my projects are usually fairly small in terms of Java projects we're talking about. So typically they'll be somewhere between 5 and 15 days in length. So what I'm looking for, and I've completed about 20 websites in the last kind of 4 years in Java, and quite a lot more in PHP. So I really, my turnover is fairly high in terms of getting the websites out there. So most of my projects are 1 or 2 man projects. So I'm not particularly responsible for a large team. So it's not actually a good reason to use a framework is if you're working in a large team, that everyone has a core framework to work to. What I'm looking for in Java when I'm putting up a Java project is something that I can put out there fairly quickly, something that doesn't take a huge amount of time to actually learn, and allows me to keep up with the changes as it goes on. So this is why, although I would like to work a little bit more with the core frameworks because they're very interesting, in practice I do most of my work sticking with the normal stuff that comes with Java. Okay. So this is, and what I've found over the years is that a lot of the innovative features that come with the frameworks, like Struts, have eventually crept their way. If you wait a couple of years, they'll eventually creep their way into the core specification. And I think a good example of that is the way that JSP 2.0 has kind of incorporated features like EL, JSTL, which of course it's sort of borrowed or semi-borrowed from lots of Struts type projects. And so 2 or 3 years ago, laying up a JSP was well, you could end up with something that looked a bit like, I don't know if you can see that very clearly, but it's not a very nice bit of code to try and maintain or try and work with. Lots of if-else statements. I mean, you didn't have to do this, but if you're a developer, there's a limit of how much you want to actually stick, how much presentation kind of logic you want to stick into a Java object. So you end up eventually, because of this whole creep where it starts out very clean, and as time goes on, more and more kind of presentation logic creeps into JSP. Now, whereas with the current setup, it's actually a lot cleaner, a lot easier to work with JSTL sort of thing. So my idea basically is just to take you through a very, very simple, trivial example project using the core specification. Nothing more than what you can download from the Sun site, apart from One package I downloaded from the Jakarta Commons website. So I'm just going to be using Tomcat 5.5 running as a container under Apache 2, using a server 2.4 and JSP 2.0 with JSTL. I'm using Java 1.5 with a little bit of the features of J2E5. I'm not quite sure what they call it anymore. But,
I don't know what they call
anyway,
it.
the latest version of the enterprise Java
EE.
And the idea I had was just basically doing a very simple food diary. So that's the website I'm going to end up with after taking you through it. And I'm going to be using the Java data objects to connect to the database and maintain connections to the database. So again, this is something that started out as a very innovative feature in Hibernate, but it's now sort of crept sort of across to certainly the latest version of the JE. And I'm using TopLink, which is again started off with Oracle, and is now again part of something you can download with the JE machines. So in order to set this up, all I need to do is to set up a persistent.xml file, which I put in my, in this case, in the meta-inf folder, in the web classes folder. I'm using, as you can see, I'm using a MySQL database. So again, it's there. And that's actually what I have to have in my library in order to run this bit of code. I need to have TopLink Essentials, TopLink Essentials agent, and then the rest of the jars are for running JSTL and EL. And then there's a couple of the EU cells, which I'm also using. So just with that, and again, it's stuff you can download and use from some website or from the Jakarta website. I'm going to set it up. So I have this JNeo object, and what I do to actually use it in a web context is I set up a listener. So every time that the context actually starts, this listener starts up, and it automatically puts in an entity manager into the servlet context for this particular application. And what I'm doing here is I'm creating an entity manager factory, and I'm passing that to a bit of custom code, a bit of that I'm using to connect to the database, and I'm setting that as an attribute as one of the context session attribute things. And once it's in the session, therefore any servlet that I call, or even JSP if I want to kind of go into that, can then call this particular database connection and do something with it if it needs to. Okay, so this is it sort of broken down in a bit more detail of that. So yeah, this is the basic one where the context is initialized, and a few lines of code I'm just sticking that in the session. This is the destroyer. And this is the code I'm using to list all the entries from the diary that I've created, and also to edit and insert those entries. So I've sort of broken that down again. The first one is to actually get an entity manager, and in this case, it just tries to create an entity manager given an instance of an entity manager factory. And this one gets the list of diary entries. Again, I'm keeping it really, really simple and trivial. I mean, there's no attempt to try and create record sets, sorry, not record sets, trying to limit it by number or anything like that. It just goes and grabs a whole lot and sticks a whole lot in this. And in this one, it's trying to get a single row from the database. In this case, it's just I'm using I'll come into a moment. I'm using it for food diary bean. It's just a normal Java class, a bean object. And it just gets that from the database, a single row. And in this one, it's editing or inserting an instance into the database. So that's three methods I'm using to do it. And again, it's fairly straightforward, nothing particularly difficult about it. But if you were doing this in struts or any of the other ones, it would you could do the same thing, but you'd be working a lot more with the sort of XML and stuff. I'm not an expert in it, so I guess other people can tell me a bit more about what I have to do if I was doing this in another framework. Okay. This is the food, the actual plain old Java object, the diary bean, and I'm starting to use. I'm using annotations a bit to actually with the JDO, but I'm also creating my own custom annotations so I can actually do a bit of checking on the actual values that people are entering into my bean. How many people are actually using the kind of new features that came with Java in 1.5 a year or two ago?
New features?
I mean annotations, enumerations. I mean, it's interesting, just doing a lot of preparation for this, I suddenly realized I could use a lot more than I was using. It's kind of interesting that you kind of get into habits of coding in a certain way or using things in a certain way, even though each are good. Okay, and what I'm doing is I've created my own custom annotation object, form checker, and I've given it some values. So what it will do, once it has the bean, once the bean has been generated from form, is I'll have a way of checking through those. And this is the form checker app interface. Again, very straightforward. But it just saves me from typing up lots of configuration and property files by sticking it all in the Java box. Yeah. And what I'm saying here is just an interface which is an annotation interface with some default values. You can see it, number, date required, with a field key. And all I'm saying is that I want that to be applied to methods only. So I can actually annotate any method that I want to. With this one. And this is how I check. This is how I just iterate around the methods in any bean that I pass to this. And I just do a check to see whether this particular annotation field key has been set on the method. If it has, then I'll check to see whether the method has a value in it, some sort of string or some sort of value. So if the value in it is null or false or empty in some way, then I go away, look at a property file, and basically store an error message, which I can then pass back to the application. So this is a bit more on this, a bit more detail about how that's done. Again, I've kept it really, really basic and simple. And then finally, to kind of tie it all together, I have a servlet which does the checking. So all I'm doing again is passing some very basic stuff. It's got three basic actions associated with it: list it, so index, insert and edit, and it does forward it to various JSPs. Let me just take a look. So I've got these are the two posts that you get. You'll see the init object is where I actually retrieve an instance of the diary DBO object from the servlet context, and that's how that sort of persistence layer works in this application. And then I have a sort of basic list and insert object here.
How many slides do you have, actually?
This is pretty much the last one.
Okay.
It will pretty short.
Yeah.
And this is the actual JSP markup here. So the nice thing I found out with working with this particular thing is that once you have a list or a list or array or anything like that, and you stick it into attribute or session, It's immediately available in the JSP using the EL syntax, and it handles it very nicely. That's been the great thing. It doesn't throw null pointer exceptions if the value happens to be null. It just puts up an empty string. And if you do an iteration for each, or you do a loop on it, it doesn't throw a null pointer if the loop happens to be null. So the array that it's referring to happens to be null, or the object, or it can't find the object itself. That's pretty much the other. Yeah. And that's basically it. So that's a very quick walkthrough of what the core specification can do with you. You don't have to use any framework here. But I'm imagining that most of you will recognize this from stuff you've worked with before, but it's somehow just drifted its way into the core specification. Okay.
Arguably, you constructed parts of your framework there, like the full validation stuff you did. It's fairly generic, so
yeah.
That's the beginnings of the framework. So keep going for another few years, and you will have reinvented some of the existing frameworks.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, but it's yes, it's. I guess the more work you do, in reality, because I've worked on a lot of sites, I do have my own little kind of library. That's not really a framework, but library to it and ways of doing things. But yeah, that's how frameworks work, isn't it?
Probably excuse my ignorance, but Java 5's annotations is one area that I don't know anything about. How does it actually pick up from the annotations in the code what to do with these, for instance, that validation check?
An annotation is just a way of documenting something, some feature or other. And in this case, it's just documenting a method. So I'm associating an annotation with a method. And I'm using the reflection, Java's reflection library, just to iterate through the methods in there to see whether it has an annotation. And those annotations now are part of the reflection API. So you can test to see whether a method or a class or anything that you've annotated actually has that particular annotation. So in this case, I've created the annotation, and I've associated it with a method, and then I do a check to see whether the values in that method are correct.
And you put that in your JSP?
It's part of the Java backend. I can show you a bit afterwards if you want.
Right.
Yeah, okay. I can show you.
Do you just have one servlet or many servlets?
It's a very trivial example. So, in reality, I would have several servlets,
Okay.
but probably no more than 3 or 4, and usually to do with some specific feature. So I'd have one servlet to handle the back end, the admin back end, the CMS kind of thing. One to handle the front end, or maybe a couple to handle the front end. And 5 or 6 JSPs templates.
So what exactly does the food diary do, and what are the core beans you're using here?
It's basically just an example of a very simple kind of CRUD application. So the whole idea is you can basically log, you can log what you had for dinner. So it's a very simple table on back end. So it's just a demonstration of a very simple.
I can see that you've got a very lightweight application there. You've got no Spring jar or Struts jar or anything like that. So does it occur to you that there might be some application for it in areas where you need really lightweight applications?
Yes, I mean if you're looking for a really high turnaround and a really fast turnaround, this is probably quite a good way to do it. But again, it just depends, I guess. You know, this is going to be a discussion we're going to have.
What is the advantage to using the frameworks? What is the advantage using your way of doing it over the using frameworks?
Well, what I'm saying is my way of, not my way of doing it particularly, but this is an illustration of the core specification that's out there now. This is basically stuff you can download and run from the Saunders.
Yeah, but what the illustration is supposed to show? What is the advantage of? What is the idea behind it?
The idea was that I was showing what's possible to do now using the core specification and doing something fairly lightweight and fairly quickly, and to show what's just an illustration basically of what's possible.
So is one of the benefits of just not having to learn a big framework?
Yeah. So not having to implement a big framework, not having to work with limitations of a big framework.
Compared to Grace framework, it seems to be very small. No?
Sorry?
Comparing to the Grace framework. In Grace framework, you just all you need to do is to create a table in a database,
right,
and then run one script which will generate all the MVC pattern for you with pages, business logic. So this is quickly. When you have a framework which generates the all repetitive work for you.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, there is definitely a discussion we're going to have in the minute, I guess, what the merits and demerits of using frameworks against just using what's already out there.
Okay, you can imagine that you're stuck at home and your broadband's gone down and you've got to finish an application by the end of the day. So you can't download anything. You've only got...
What about pen drives?
Any more questions for Kevin?
Why do you choose to use Java when you build something like small? Why don't you stick to PHP?
Because a lot of my clients want some fairly heavy media processing on the back end as well at the same time. So, I mean, they don't want. If it's just CRUD, then I will use PHP. Or they want to send a few emails or something to. But what they'll often want to do is they'll want to upload, 100 images at once, or even 1,000 images onto the site, and have something at the back end go through those images, create watermarks, and do all sorts of clever things with the images. So that would be a reason I use Java.
And on the PHP front, I guess what I can chip in is that Java has so much like tool support, and if you're developers, that's really helpful. So I think PHP is getting there now, tool support, but you can't compare in terms of IDEs and stuff.
Now what I meant is that Java is quite a powerful thing for building quite powerful things. But something like this is probably quicker done in Ruby or whatever, I don't know.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's not a real life example. It's code, kind of strip down the code to show.
I suppose when frameworks were invented, the actual, like Kevin says, the actual standard APIs were quite limited. And it's very interesting now that some new functionality has gone right into the latest specification. I guess that what the frameworks do have, the actual standard APIs have caught up with it in many ways, and things like Hibernate and Java server bases have gone are more like standardized. There are less, I suppose, business reasons and recruitment reasons why you would hire someone or develop an application that goes off the beaten track. So it's very interesting. How much experience of Java do you have? It's a couple of years, you would say?
No.
No.
I've been doing it 5 years.
5 years,
yeah.
right.
But I'm not a full-time Java developer. I think it's intermingled with Flash and PHP.
Is there anything that's specific about your kind of approach that kind of makes it easier to use sort of web hosting firms to sort of?
Yeah, I mean that's another feature is I don't always know what I'm going to end up putting my sites on. Sometimes I can get, often I can set the server up myself and have a very customized configuration, but sometimes I don't. You can work on servers where they said we're only going to code in Java 1.3 and we're going to run Netscape iPlanet, whatever version they were running, and I just didn't have any control of that. I just had to develop for that. But I mean, actually, this is even with this. Well, I mean, a lot of the frameworks can actually offer fairly conform. So yeah, that's the reason why. And the other one is time. It takes a lot of time to work to learn these frameworks.
Right. Do you want to talk very briefly about Spring MVC? And obviously, Spring MVC stands for Model View Controller. And that is one of the first design patterns that was invented about 5 years ago to avoid what we called then spaghetti JSP. And the old way, circa the turn of the century, was the worst way you could develop, which is to define a lot of form beams and a lot of JSPs, and the hardest thing in that design was like you put too much business logic inside your Java server pages, and obviously if you've done PHP there was no way of refactoring that easily. So one of the ideas that the architects came up with was to split the design, split the concerns, so that you have a model, which is obviously your business data, you have a view, which will be your Java server pages, and you have a controller, which is obviously where you bind the model and the view together. So, for example, your model would be a database, and your view will be your what turns out to be HTML, or what gets rendered as HTML. So Spring MVC is a class of applications, a class of framework that we call request-orientated, and that is different from Java Server Faces and Tapestry, where things are component-orientated, which is, if you've ever used Java Studio Creator, where you can drag and drop objects onto which looks like a rich client user interface designer, and you can build a web app similar to the way you can build a Swing app. That's the general idea. The whole servlet APIs are abstracted away or hidden from you, and you can't access them directly. Of course, you may be able to do a cast to reveal what's running behind, running under the surface, as ducks in on a waterway. So, so it's a request-orientated framework, and although I can't show you any proprietary code,
So what did you call it?
a request-orientated framework rather than a component-orientated framework. That's what I was trying to describe. There's no pen here, but
Sorry.
here's a marker. Let me do it. The architecture, what I would call action, requests, orientated frameworks, is that you have an input to your action, and that binds your model, which is normally backed by some database, and that action does certain things to the model, receives the input, which is your request, and then that is passed, the action does some business logic, then passes that, the results of that, of its work to a view handler, which I call there. And then that view handler generates whatever representation, which might be XML or a PDF or most commonly HTML. And that goes to your browser. And this is the model of an action request orientated framework. A component orientated framework is very similar, but hides all of that. You still have your output and your input. But what happens here is that you have a front controller, which maps that to an event dispatcher. In fact, what that does is, say, suppose you were building this as your web interface. So you have a left-hand side, a navigation bar at the top. That actually gets mapped to a component which owns this component, which owns this component, which owns this component. And you have an event stimuli that is targeted at a particular component, which might be that one. So you get a sort of a chain of events dispatching until it reaches the targeted component. Or if, for example, if you have a component here that was disabled, then it will never reach that subcomponent, it would just get rejected back. So there are two ways. If I go back to my previous one, it's just a different way of building a front end. So you get your event dispatcher, which builds a component tree, which is this thing down here. Your component deals with it and then passes that back to a renderer. In fact, this whole tree is created for each request, and then that component tree is passed back to a renderer, or as it's known in JSF, which is the view kit. And in that way, you can see how Java Server Faces renders themes or does or produces content for mobile phones and stuff. So that's a very brief introduction.
Just a bit to that. I think events are just one context within which you can look at components, but you can have a very simple example, like if you have a shopping cart and then you have various items in the shopping cart, and you can look at items as components, and then they will have specific APIs, to deal with them. So you can have, go to an item and decide to remove it or to increase it or stuff like that. In that respect, when you're writing code, you'll have a specific component to represent items, and then you can embed as many items as possible in your shopping cart. I don't know if that makes sense.
Can I ask you something about that as well? Yeah. If you're talking about this thing where, my understanding of an MVC, I haven't used the Spring MVC, but if you had something like your shopping cart where you're adding items to it, and you would actually be changing some amount here, and then it would actually reflect in terms of your total. As you would change one thing and the total is getting re-rendered, would it re-render the total automatically? Is that kind of like instantaneous kind of feedback?
Then you're getting into the whole Ajax thing, and it depends on if your framework supports that. You could do that if your framework supports that, but if you're using a traditional model, then you're going to have to render the whole page, except all those items. all those independent items would have their own states, and so you could render them. They will use the same rendering methods to render themselves.
Would you be able to do all that within the Spring MVC framework? Is Ajax supported within that as well? This is
I am not for Spring here. Well, if it was, I would tell you.
Well, to answer your question, yes, and you could put Ajax on any framework, and most of the buzz is to add Ajax. That was the buzz last year, so the answer to the question is yes, you can do that. That sort of dynamic or rendering in real time. But Spring MVC, like struts, like web work, is based on the whole request. There's no component there that to help you channel through, import and build a user interface. Now, if you look at an example of a Spring MVC controller, it doesn't matter what it is, you can see the actual design of the actual conceptual design. You have to, you get your input, which is the servlet request, and a response as well, and you do some kind of work. And this method obviously handles the case when a business account isn't found. And what it does, what Spring will do is, well, it doesn't do anything, it supports implicitly a creation of something called a model and a view object. And this is Spring's sort of idiosyncratic way of binding a model and a view together, which takes a little bit of a while to get into. The benefits of using Spring, in a nutshell, to keep the presentation short, is that it's part of the Spring framework where you have all your dependency injections. If you're using Spring already, it's very easy to define an action controller. For example, this is the view action controller, and if it will let me, what you can do in the Spring definition file is bind, it's obviously not on that one, you have to trust me on this, you can bind your Spring data access objects, and now we're getting into a bit of architecture there, things that work into the back end. If you're using a framework, you can bind them directly into your actions, whereas with other frameworks you would have to implicitly get a Spring application context and then retrieve your data access objects. One thing about this XML file is that all the actions here, like instructs, are singletons, which they are created once and once only. Web work is different. It does throwaway actions, and it takes a bit of a while to understand the difference. But the benefit is if all your actions are singleton, then it's very easy to wire within Spring. By just, for example, I could write if my say my cancel account controller needed authorization, and supposing I did have an authorization service and there was an actual parameter in that being called authorization service, then I can just bind it like that, and Spring will render that for me in real time. It will bind that in, wire that for me at application deployment time, not real time. I think. So, okay, so the other things about, I suppose the most important thing about a framework is that, for example, Spring is that you have much better architectural control, especially if you use inversion and control. That's the point of all the XML files. It gives you maintainability for the long term, and that might be important to you. It'd probably be important to your bosses if he or she or if the business that you are working for wants to maintain a business application over the long term. It has serious ramifications for recruitment and stuff that people should understand what a framework does and does not. So, what else is there in Spring? This application context is very simple. That would be one of several in a business application. I'm going to try and find in this one what JSP. Look at open. Unfortunately, I can't run on any of this stuff because the code that I got from this book doesn't work. And it's not my book, it's a borrowed book. So it's a reference. It's like Expert Spring MVC and Webflow. So the authors have been very naughty in uploading code that doesn't work. So it proves this point. So actually,
perhaps fixing it is an exercise for the reader.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, but it's not good if you've got a deadline. It's not good if you've got a deadline. But hopefully they'll fix it. Yeah, Spring has less of the tag libraries. This particular beast here is a nested path, and that's sort of like if you've done Pascal, and you have an object that you want to do a bit of shorthand, the with x, instead of doing a lot of x.y.z or z, you can say with x.y and get access to the parameters of your object z. So there's a few other bits and pieces of it. Of course, this is a JSP2, so you new account, div layer there. Okay, you've got your tags to handle and render the forms. So that would be username and password. There are also error tags, and that's what I'm looking for. You have a Spring is binding, has bind errors. So you have the concept of global form errors, or if you have a field like a username that has an error, that would be individual form errors or form field errors. Okay, so, and of course, a good architect would split up his packages to reflect the architecture. So this book author has done very well. And these would be Hibernate or Toppling Java database persistence capable objects. Your service would be your business logic, which could extend to EJBs, web services, SOAP, and of course this is all your MVC layer. So that is a very basic Spring application which unfortunately doesn't work because I've tried deploying it and there's something wrong with it. That it doesn't deploy, but if I'm lucky, the default, thankfully Rod didn't let that situation happen with his demonstration code, which he has on the actual Spring website. So one application works that I know, and the JPEG store does, but I didn't have time to set. I apologise for not setting up. the database correctly in time. But everybody can do a Java pet store, and that, trust me, that does work, which is Rod's version of the infamous pet store application. I'll start a new session because I look at what I was doing before. And I go to, I've been trying it, look, I've tried it and it doesn't, I've tried many combinations. And then I actually went to Apress, and there's a
startup error.
Yeah, and I've tried to find a log for it, and there's nothing apparent. Nothing apparent, and as of June 2006, someone complained that they couldn't run the source code from the Apress website, and that just shows you why it got 1 star out of 5 on Amazon because they held back. Okay, it's countries, which is, this is a Spring MVC application, very basic one, where you can choose your country, and it's just showing you the paginations. You can filter under U, give you the UK, it should do. Strange. G you get Great Britain, yeah. G for Great Britain. Yes. Well done.
Don't book your holiday tickets with us.
And it generates a PDF. I hope. Please don't crash. Yay! It generates your Excel. So using the same architecture that I put out on down there, it generates Excel. So that's what you get out of the box. So that does work without no database connections. And that's what a framework does give you. But of course, Spring tries to be more than just the Spring MVC. There's a whole lot of things going on there.
What books would you recommend other than that one you just talked about?
I think that is the book, unfortunately.
There's one about Spring that I've got. It's very good. Spring generally, not Spring MVC.
Spring, is it Pro Spring?
Spring in Action. The
Raw Spring.
Oh, right.
Spring in Action. I think it's a Manning books.
Yes.
The in action book.
But the one with this, the same.
No, it's got a picture of a person, tall person in the road.
Well, this one doesn't belong to me, so you're welcome to have a quick scan of it. It belongs to my colleague. No?
I'd say one compliment of Spring is that the manual's so good that you don't actually need most of the basic books. The books really help because if they add examples, that's one thing that the manual doesn't have huge great examples. It has config examples, but not that much code.
Yeah, I think the point about that book is that it just didn't work. You would expect that for a published book, so they were pretty naughty. But I think they were concentrating on the Spring Webflow thing, which is a bit different, as in long-term wizard continuations and an actual page-by-page navigation, almost workflow-like stuff. So that's all I have on Spring MVC action-orientated applications, unless I'm sure you have questions.
Are there any drawbacks with it? Or what are the advantages or the drawbacks compared to using Struts or GFS?
It's a different kettle of fish, but depends. The only drawback I can see is that you would have to, and that might be minor at this point, you don't get the straight integration with Spring out of the box. And that's, I guess, a minor feature, because you are probably more worried about wiring your business logic beans. And what you might want to do then is passing the application context somehow to your struts layer, and then you manually grab the bean, the service that you need, which is what people have done time, before even Spring Framework. They just made a dependency. I need this kind of SOAP interface. Spring is a fancy way of injecting that dependency without polluting the code, so that you can, if you want, run unit tests and out of the container. 5 years ago, it was very hard to actually test web applications, let alone EJBs, because you always had to, there was always some dependency on the servlet request. Now, a lot has changed, so I guess that's the only drawback, because most frameworks support Spring in some form or the other. It's just your choice, kettle, whether you like it black, grey or white.
There are lots of kind of sort of integration sort of benefits, or ease of coding benefits with using sort of Spring at the model layer and as a replacement for something like struts, instead of just using the Spring sort of model sort of architecture, instead of using all of the view control and
Spring has, the MVC has a pretty good architecture, and so if you like that architecture a lot, then it's worth looking at it. There are a few finicky things, like I found today, like Spring MVC shares now with struts, interceptors, and architecture just very quickly, which is so if you remember your action, the action there, and that would grab your business log, bind your business logic to your database and produce some result so that you can render a view. But what you can have around it are interceptors. And what I think is, and the architecture is a little bit not pure with these interceptors that I found today. For example, I wanted to find out when I had a stale HTTP session. And of course, there was no way within an interceptor to go and call another action. For example, if I've got, if I've detected someone's stale, I want it to call another action so I can say, do some nice little whatever I need to do and give him, that user, a nice interface. Like, that might be a JSP, and that would be like the company conformant page. What I had to do is do a redirect, a horrible redirect. I had to construct the servlet string directly and then redirect. It was a bit horrible. So
was that Spring or?
That was Spring MVC. Unless there's some knowledge.
I think we can throw a model and view exception.
You can?
It's a bit clumsy, but it's an exception that holds a new sort of view.
See, there's someone who knows better. And the other thing, so that's a con. A pro is that Spring, because it's wired, once you have that application context, you can have a handler exception, like you said. So any exception that gets thrown on or in the Spring MVC layer gets wired to an exception handler resolver. And in that exception handler resolver, you can say like catch a login exception, catch a concurrency exception, and feed it off to the proper web page. So you get that kind of magic that happens underneath the surface with the Spring framework. And if you use Spring MVC, if if you don't use Spring MVC and you have to use, say, like what Struts has, Struts 1.1 has, I'm sure 2 does have the global error handler to do that, which would be the same sort of thing. Question?
How difficult have you found it to recruit people that know Spring
I'm not a recruiter, but so I admit to that. But I admit that if there's a lot of people who do use Spring framework and are familiar with the concept of injection, and I don't think it will be that difficult, to be honest. There are probably a lot more people who know Struts 1.0, but less people who know web work. But because Spring MVC can sit on the back of Spring for light, then you're going to have to grill them. Prepare your interview questions to make sure they know what they're talking about. Yeah.
I just want to point one thing, that Spring itself is something separate to Spring MVC.
Yeah.
And I successfully use Spring with tapestry and tapestry.
Yes, it's already been done.
And additionally, the cross-cutting concepts such as authentication is possible to implement by AOP, so you don't have to ASPEC-oriented programming. So
you can do that.
In declarative way, you are setting up some constraints of redirecting the flow. So you don't have to say that, for example, it is impossible to do it with struts, because I believe there is a way to integrate struts with Spring as is tapestry is done.
Yeah, I mean, there's many ways to skin a cat, and that's perhaps the point that Kevin was alluding to, is that how much time do you have, when do you have to do it, always yesterday. So it's a fair point, you can use AOP. I use AOP with Spring too, and in fact I don't have to know much about it. Somebody's already done that. Another colleague in the team has set up the Spring AOP syntax to catch, to define transactions on any service beam. So it's really quite simple. If you package your things, if you design, if you develop or design your package naming scheme that way, it's very easy to say everything in my service package, I want to start a transaction declaratively.
It has a name like set. For
Yeah.
example, it has a different constraint on the gap.
Yeah, that's
Relink is another role from settings.
Yeah, and you can do that. I mean, Spring 2 is remarkable because obviously they've got the chief scientist now from IBM, Adrian Collier, who was the Aspect J lead.
You can even get rid of this whole XML hell using annotation, as previously we showed. Yeah.
Unfortunately, many of us, including myself, are still stuck on JDK 1.4 dot whatever, and we can't move yet to the latest Java EE or Java 5 or 6 version. But in the last week I've heard DEA have gone to, they've just been certified Java EE, and I don't know what's happening, what the hell's happening with IBM WebSphere. I mean, they're the last guys, and thankfully I'm off that project. And of course, apart from that, everything's looking good. So hopefully there'll be at least a job this year with Java EE5, and I can finally start doing generics or something and catch up this guy here. So, any more questions on Spring MVC?
I haven't used Spring MVC, but we've been using Java 7 Faces for about a year now.
How do you find that?
Well, we like it actually.
Yeah.
But one of the great things we like is that it integrates really nicely with the spring backing beans, the spring beans.
Yeah.
In Java Server Faces, they have this concept of backing beans that replaces your like structs, actions, action forms. But you can declare all these in your Spring context as Spring beans. And now with Spring 2, you've got a session,